What if trying harder is actually the problem? Like, what if the whole concept of discipline, the very thing we've all been told our entire lives is the ultimate key to a successful life, is actually a trap?
Yeah, that's a huge question to start with.
Right. But think about how often you hear that word. I mean, we hear it from life coaches, fitness influencers, our bosses, our parents, and, well, worst of all, we hear it from ourselves inside our own heads.
Oh, constantly. The inner monologue is brutal.
Exactly. We tell ourselves that if we just had more discipline, we'd finally lose the weight or write the book or, I don't know, stop endlessly scrolling on our phones at midnight. We treat discipline like it's this magical moral virtue that we're somehow just failing to grasp.
And it's a question that completely upends how we think about achievement. And frankly, how we think about our own self-worth. I mean, we're so conditioned by society to believe that if we're failing at something, if you're struggling to maintain a habit, it's a personal moral failing.
Like you're just not built right.
Exactly. We're told we just aren't pushing ourselves hard enough. The underlying message is that success requires this endless self-punishment and restraint. Like we have to force ourselves into submission. But when you actually look at the psychology of human behavior, relying on brute force discipline is a guaranteed recipe for total burnout. It just goes against how the human brain is wired to function over the long term.
Right. And I really want to ground this in a real story that brought this home for me, because it completely changed how I look at this. It comes from one of our sources today, Dr. Sharon Gam. She's a personal trainer, an exercise physiologist, and a wellness coach.
And if you look at her life from the outside, she looks like the absolute poster child for ironclad willpower.
Oh, totally. People look at her routine, the way she consistently eats whole foods, the way she exercises every single day without fail, and they say to her, wow, I wish I had your discipline. They look at her like she has this superhero ability to endure discomfort that the rest of us just, lack.
Yeah, but her response to that is fascinating.
It really is. She openly admits that she actually isn't disciplined at all.
Which is such a jarring thing to hear from someone in the fitness industry, right? It sounds completely counterintuitive when you look at her daily output. The natural assumption is that she must be waking up every day at dawn, looking at some grueling workout, and just aggressively forcing herself to do it through sheer grit.
But she makes this profound distinction that I think everyone listening really needs to hear. She says that discipline is forcing yourself to do something you hate. Let that sink in for a second. Discipline is making yourself do something you fundamentally do not want to do. She exercises and eats well simply because she wants to.
She actually enjoys the process.
Yeah, it aligns perfectly with her identity and how she wants to feel on a daily basis. She isn't white-knuckling her way through her life. And well, that is the massive paradigm shift we are exploring today on this deep dive. Because to figure out why our willpower keeps betraying us, we've pulled together a massive stack of research today. We're crossing boundaries, looking at everything from behavioral psychology and how neurodivergent brains work, to the pretty shocking history of school punishments, and even the science of environment design.
And our mission for this deep dive is to look at all of this data to understand why you, the person listening right now, do not need more discipline. If you're listening to this on your commute or, while you're doing the dishes and you're feeling exhausted and guilty because you think you lack willpower, we really want to dismantle that guilt completely.
We really do. We want to show you the science of why forcing yourself doesn't work, and offer a softer, smarter, and infinitely more sustainable way to approach your life. You're not broken. The system of a discipline you've been taught is what's broken.
Well said.
Let's really talk about what that struggle feels like on a visceral level. Because, it is so incredibly relatable. We have all been there. You decide you're going to change your life, you get fed up with your current situation, and you set a rigid goal. Maybe this new intense fitness routine where you promise to run 3 miles every morning, or a strict rule to stop looking at any screens after 8 o'clock.
Yeah, the classic New Year's resolution energy.
Exactly. You start out strong, you have that initial burst of adrenaline, you're white-knuckling it through those first few days, and you feel this sense of pride because you're finally being good. And then, inevitably, reality hits.
Always does.
You have a terrible day at work, you get poor sleep, you slip up, you miss a day, and the spiral begins.
And the emotional fallout from that single slip-up is usually devastating. The guilt and the self-criticism, they just flood in almost immediately. You don't just think, oh, I missed a day of running. You think, I am a failure, I have no self-control, I will never change.
Yeah.
You take a single behavioral lapse and turn it into a profound character flaw.
Right. And then what do? We open our phones and look at influencers online who seem to have this endless well of willpower. They're posting their 5 a.m. ice baths and their perfectly meal-prepped lunches. And you just think, what is wrong with me? Why can't I just be disciplined like them?
It's such a toxic comparison trap.
It is. But trying to live purely on discipline is like trying to drive a car across the country using only the starter motor. Think about how a car works, right? The starter motor is designed to give a quick, powerful, high-energy jolt to get the engine turning. It's essential for that first spark. But it is not meant to sustain the journey.
Definitely not.
If you somehow rigged your car to keep the starter motor engaged while you were driving down the highway at 60 miles an hour, the motor would overheat, catch fire, and completely burn out within a few miles. And that is exactly what happens to our nervous systems when we rely on discipline.
I love that starter motor analogy because the psychology behind why that burnout happens is incredibly well documented. It really comes down to the fundamental difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is when you're doing something solely for an external reward or to avoid a punishment.
The classic carrot and stick.
Exactly. You work a job you hate just for the paycheck. You force yourself to the gym just so people will compliment your body. Or you study purely to avoid the shame of failing a class. That extrinsic pressure gives you that short-term jolt, just like the starter motor. It can get you off the couch. But it crumbles over time because the human brain habituates to external pressures.
Well, wait, I want to push back on that for a second, though, because if I look at my own life, or just society in general, external rewards do seem to work. Like, if my boss offers me a massive bonus to work over the weekend, I'm going to do it. If the government threatens to fine me for speeding, I slow down. So it feels like the carrot and the stick do actually control behavior. Why are we saying they crumble?
That's a fair point. They do control immediate compliance, yes, but they do not create lasting, self-sustaining drive. And in fact, relying too heavily on them can actually destroy whatever natural drive you might have had to begin with.
Really? Destroy it?
Yeah, there's a fascinating phenomenon in behavioral psychology called the over-justification effect. And this completely dismantles the idea that rewarding behavior always encourages it. The over-justification effect happens when external rewards are applied too heavily to something a person already inherently enjoys doing. When that happens, the external reward actually destroys the natural intrinsic interest in the task.
Okay, walk me through how that actually looks in practice. Because it sounds like you're saying that paying someone to do what they love will make them hate it.
In many cases, yes. Imagine a young child who loves to draw. They'll sit at the kitchen table for hours with crayons, completely lost in their own imagination, drawing just for the pure joy of it. They are intrinsically motivated. The reward is the activity itself. Now imagine you decide you want to encourage this behavior, so you start paying the child $1 for every picture they finish. At first, they might draw even more. But very quickly, their brain rewires the association. They begin to associate the act of drawing entirely with the external reward of the money.
Oh, wow. So the joy is gone.
Exactly. The joy of the process vanishes, replaced by the transaction. Then a few weeks later, you stop paying them. What happens? They stop drawing completely. The external reward completely erased their internal joy. They now view drawing as work that requires compensation rather than play.
That is terrifying when you apply it to adults. When we try to force ourselves to do things using sheer discipline, when we promise ourselves we can buy a new outfit if we just stick to our diet, or when we use external pressures like social media accountability to force ourselves to write a novel, we might actually be killing our natural organic motivation to do those things.
We're turning our own lives into a series of transactional chores, and this connects beautifully to something called expectancy theory. This theory, developed by Victor Vroom, argues that our motivation isn't just a simple sliding scale of high or low. It's essentially a mathematical formula made up of 3 very specific parts. If any one of these parts drops to 0, your motivation drops to 0.
Okay, break down the formula for us.
First is expectancy. Do you genuinely believe your effort will actually lead to performance? If you think a task is impossible, you won't even try. Second is instrumentality. Do you believe your performance will actually lead to a reward? If you think your boss will ignore your hard work, you won't do it. And third is valence. Do you actually care about the reward being offered?
That third one, valence, feels like the real trap here. Do you actually care about the reward? Because I feel like we spend so much of our lives chasing rewards that we think we are supposed to want rather than things we actually deeply value.
It's the most critical piece of the puzzle. When we rely on harsh discipline, we are almost always forcing ourselves toward rewards we don't truly value deep down in our core. We think we want the societal approval of looking a certain way, or the prestige of a certain job title, or just the image of being a highly productive person.
But if we don't actually care.
Right. If the core of who you are doesn't deeply value that specific outcome, your valence is zero. And when valence is zero, the motivation formula falls apart. No amount of discipline can force you to care about something you fundamentally don't care about.
That makes me think of Frederick Herzberg and his two-factor theory from the research. It feels very connected to this idea of what actually drives us.
Yeah.
But I want to make sure I'm understanding it right, because it always seemed a little counterintuitive to me when I first read about it.
Let's break it down, because Herzberg's research in the workplace completely changes how we should view our own personal goals. Herzberg found that the things that make us dissatisfied in a job, or really in any prolonged task, are not the opposites of the things that make us satisfied. He split human needs into two categories. He called the baseline expectations hygiene factors.
Oh, wait, hygiene factors, like brushing our teeth or washing our hands.
Right.
What does Herzberg actually mean by that in terms of our daily to-do lists and our motivation?
Yeah, it's a funny term. He used the term hygiene in the medical sense, things that prevent disease, but don't necessarily promote robust health. In a workplace, hygiene factors are things like having a physically safe environment, getting decent pay, or having a boss who isn't actively abusive.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you don't have these things, you will be utterly miserable. You'll be actively dissatisfied. But, and this is the crucial part, simply having them does not make you motivated. It just brings you up to a baseline of zero. It prevents misery.
So what actually motivates us?
True motivators, the second factor, are entirely different things. True motivators are a sense of achievement, feeling recognized for your unique skills, doing work that is inherently interesting, and having opportunities for personal growth.
Oh, I see exactly how this applies to discipline now.
Yeah.
When we use strict punitive discipline on ourselves, we're almost exclusively focusing on those hygiene factors. We're trying to avoid the negative feelings. We force ourselves to the gym to avoid the guilt of skipping it. We force ourselves to answer emails at night to avoid the anxiety of a crowded inbox tomorrow.
Yes.
We're just trying to prevent our own internal misery. But avoiding guilt is not a true motivator. It doesn't give us joy or a sense of self-actualization or a feeling of deep mastery.
Precisely. You're trying to build a vibrant, sustainable life on a foundation of merely avoiding pain. And psychologically, biologically, that is just not how human beings are wired to thrive. You can survive on pain avoidance for a while, but you cannot flourish.
Right. And if discipline fails us so completely on an individual psychological level, it really makes sense to look at how it's failed us systemically. If science shows punishment doesn't work, why is our entire society built on it? I mean, look at how we raise kids or run our workplaces or manage our schools. We are obsessed with punitive discipline.
We really are.
And the history here is absolutely wild. We dove into the archives, the Los Angeles Institute for Restorative Practices, the LARP. They have this incredible, deeply researched documentation of how school discipline has evolved in the United States. And it's basically a 200-year history of a society repeatedly slamming its head against a brick wall.
It's a history of desperately trying to force compliance, assuming that harder punishments will create better people, and constantly finding out that force doesn't create genuine, lasting change. It only creates fear and resentment.
Let's go all the way back to 1831 in Boston. There's a grammar school master named William Clough, and he was notoriously harsh, even for the 1800s. We're talking about a time when physical punishment was standard, but Clough took it to an extreme. He would violently whip students for the tiniest infractions, mispronouncing words during a reading, bringing the wrong notebook to class, or just looking out the window.
Just brutal.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, the community didn't just accept it. The parents actually rebelled against this. It became a huge public scandal in Boston. And this scandal caught the attention of Horace Mann, who's often called the father of the common school movement in America. Mann looked at this situation and came to a profound realization that was incredibly ahead of its time. He essentially said that corporal punishment makes an offender cease to do ill, but it never ever makes them love to do well.
Which is the exact essence of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, recognized nearly 200 years ago. Mann saw that you can beat a child into terrified submission. You can make them sit perfectly still out of fear. But you cannot beat them into loving mathematics or loving literature. You can enforce a behavior, but you cannot enforce a passion.
But the tragedy is, society didn't listen. Or at least we kept forgetting that lesson over and over. If we fast forward to the period right after World War II, the focus in American schools shifted heavily toward maintaining strict conformity. We were in the Cold War era, and the cultural mood was all about falling in line.
Right.
Suspensions and expulsions became the new tools to force kids to comply. We moved away from physical beatings, but we just replaced them with administrative exile.
So what?
Then, in the 1970s, there was a brief moment of pushback for students' rights. This led to the famous Goss versus Lopez Supreme Court case in 1975, which essentially ruled that students facing suspension actually had the right to due process. They couldn't just be thrown out of school on a principal's whim without a hearing.
But that push toward granting students basic rights absolutely terrified the establishment. And this is where we have to look at the why behind systemic changes. By the 1980s and 1990s, the cultural climate shifted dramatically. We had the crack epidemic, skyrocketing urban crime rates, and a media landscape heavily focused on gang violence. Politicians from both sides of the aisle started panicking. They pushed for incredibly harsh, sweeping measures to regain control. Presidents Reagan, Bush, Clinton, they all championed variations of zero-tolerance policies.
Zero tolerance meaning if you break a rule, there's no nuance, no context, no hearing, you were just gone, suspended or expelled automatically.
Exactly. And this was heavily influenced by the broken windows theory of policing, which was incredibly popular at the time. The broken windows theory argued that if you leave a broken window unfixed in a neighborhood, it signals that no one cares, which invites more serious crime. Therefore, the theory suggested that punishing tiny, minor infractions incredibly severely would somehow prevent larger violent crimes from ever happening. Schools adopted this wholesale. Yeah. A kid brings a butter knife to school to cut their apple, expelled for possessing a weapon. A student talks back to a teacher, suspended for insubordination.
That's just wild.
Yeah.
Zero tolerance was the ultimate systemic expression of strict discipline. It was the societal version of what we do to ourselves, right? White-knuckling it, accepting no excuses, showing no grace. And the crucial question we have to ask is, did it work? Did zero tolerance make schools pristine, perfect environments of learning?
You look at the data from the last 3 decades, and it is just a resounding tragic no. It didn't work at all. If anything, it backfired spectacularly. It caused immense psychological harm to an entire generation of students. It vastly increased high school dropout rates. It directly created what we now call the school-to-prison pipeline, where kids were pushed out of the educational environment and directly into the juvenile justice system.
That is so sad.
And worst of all, it disproportionately targeted marginalized students, particularly Black and Latino youth, and students with disabilities. The prevalence of these harsh policies did not make schools safer. It just alienated, traumatized, and discarded the exact students who needed adult support the most.
And we're seeing the exact same failure playing out right now, today, when we look at the data from the Truth Initiative regarding the youth vaping crisis. Schools across the country are dealing with a massive problem of students who are deeply addicted to nicotine e-cigarettes. And what is the default disciplinary response for a lot of school administrators? They fall right back into the 1990s playbook. They suspend the kids who are caught vaping in the bathrooms.
Which is a purely punitive, discipline-based reaction. It treats a public health crisis and a chemical addiction as a simple moral failure that needs to be punished.
Right. But the Truth Initiative points out that punishing these students absolutely does not help them quit nicotine. When you suspend a kid for vaping, you send them home, often unsupervised, where they're isolated, their stress levels skyrocket, and they have even more access to the substance they're addicted to.
It's the worst possible environment for them.
Exactly. It often leads to worse academic outcomes and deeper addiction. It completely ignores the root cause of why they're vaping in the first place, whether that's anxiety, peer pressure, or an underlying mental health struggle. We are punishing the symptom and ignoring the disease.
We constantly, stubbornly assume that strict rules and harsh consequences are the only way to create order. But the education scholar Alfie Kohn points out a vital, fundamental flaw in this entire framework of how we view discipline. He notes that when a student acts out in class, when they are disruptive or refuse to do their work, the immediate reaction from the teacher or the administration is always to ask, how do I force them back on task?
Yes, how do I make them comply? What punishment will make them sit down and be quiet?
Exactly. But Ton says we almost rarely stop to ask the much more important, much more revealing question. What is the task?
Oh man, that blew my mind when I read it in his research. What is the task? Because it places the burden back on the system, not just the individual. He talks about giving students these completely disconnected, meaningless assignments. He uses the example of a worksheet on our friend the adverb.
Right, the adverb worksheet.
And he says, If you force a kid to sit perfectly still under fluorescent lights for an hour and do something that is incredibly boring, devoid of context, and has absolutely no relevance to their actual life or curiosity, well, of course they're going to act out. It would be amazing, almost concerning, if they didn't rebel against that.
It's such a profound shift in perspective. If the task itself is meaningless, if it lacks any intrinsic value, no amount of discipline is going to magically make it a valuable learning experience. We rely on rewards and punishments to bridge the gap between a meaningless task and human engagement. But rewards and punishments are really just two sides of the same manipulative coin. A reward asks the person, what do I get for doing this? A punishment asks, what happens to me if I don't do this?
And neither of those questions actually matters in the long run. Neither of those questions builds character or genuine passion. The questions we want people to be asking, the questions we want to ask ourselves about our own lives are, what kind of person do I want to be? And what kind of community do we want to build?
And you cannot force someone to answer those deeper existential questions through discipline. You cannot threaten someone into discovering their life's purpose. You can only guide them there through connection, empathy, and genuine understanding.
This brings me to a story that I think perfectly captures this shift, this pivot from trying to blindly force discipline to actually finding a sustainable human way to live. It's from Marceli Smith Boyle. She's a certified positive discipline parenting educator and a life coach. And she shared this incredibly vulnerable, very real realization she had about her own parenting.
It's a story that I think is going to resonate deeply with anyone who has ever felt like they are constantly nagging. And I don't just mean nagging a child. It applies to nagging a partner, nagging an employee, or, most commonly, endlessly nagging ourselves inside our own heads.
So true. Marceli realized that she felt like she was constantly nagging her 11-year-old son. Every interaction felt tense. She was always correcting his posture, telling him to put his shoes away, reminding him to do his homework, trying to discipline his every behavior. The atmosphere in the house was just heavy with friction. So she decided to do a very simple, very revealing experiment.
The paper experiment.
Right. She took a blank piece of paper and decided to track her interactions with him for a single day. On the left side of the paper, she put a tally mark every time she corrected him. Every time she used discipline, gave an instruction, or criticized something he did. On the right side of the paper, she put a tally mark every time she connected with him.
And by connection, we mean a moment of genuine warmth, empathy, shared joy, or just listening to him without trying to fix or change his behavior.
Right.
Right.
A moment where she wasn't demanding anything from him. And after just one day of tracking this, the results on that piece of paper were staggering. Her corrections more than doubled her connections. The left side of the page was full of tally marks. The right side was nearly bare. She looked at that paper and had this massive epiphany. She realized no wonder they were both so incredibly annoyed and miserable all the time. The constant, relentless discipline was completely eroding the foundation of their relationship. The discipline wasn't even working anymore. It was just falling on deaf, defiant ears.
Because when all you hear is correction, when every interaction feels like an evaluation where you're falling short, you naturally build up defensive walls. It's a biological survival mechanism. You shut down to protect your ego and your sense of self.
She realized that when a person feels loved, valued, and deeply understood for who they are naturally open to your influence. They want to cooperate. But when they're constantly picked apart and told what to do, they resist just to maintain their autonomy. And the crazy thing is, we do this to ourselves all the time. We are the nagging parent and the defiant child trapped in the same brain.
We really do. We are so incredibly punitive with our own minds. We treat ourselves with a level of harshness that we would never accept from a friend or a partner.
The data from restorative resources gives us a fantastic, concrete framework for understanding this internal dynamic. They compare the traditional punitive mindset to the restorative mindset. And if you're listening to this right now, I want you to actively think about how you apply these definitions to the voice inside your own head.
It's a very confronting exercise.
It is. The punitive mindset, which is what most of us grew up with, defines misbehavior as a deliberate choice to break the rules. It focuses entirely on establishing guilt. It's obsessed with assigning blame, shaming the wrongdoer, and dispensing a consequence to make them pay for what they did.
Think about how violently that sounds in your own internal monologue. You set an alarm for 6 a.m. to go to the gym. The alarm goes off, you're exhausted, and you sleep through it. You skip the workout. Immediately, your punitive inner voice wakes up and says, "You chose to be lazy. You are guilty of failing your fitness plan again. You have no willpower. You should be ashamed of yourself."
So mean.
It is. That is a purely punitive internal discipline system. It assumes malice or deep character flaws where there might just be fatigue.
It's brutal. And the worst part is it doesn't work. Beating yourself up doesn't make you more likely to go to the gym the next day. It just drains the energy you need to try again.
Right.
But the restorative mindset is entirely different. It requires a complete mental pivot. The restorative mindset defines misbehavior not as a malicious choice, but as a breakdown in relationships, or as an unconscious, clumsy attempt to meet an unmet human need. It shifts the focus away from assigning guilt and moves entirely toward understanding feelings, repairing any harm done, and addressing the root causes of the issue.
If we take that restorative lens and apply it to ourselves, it changes absolutely everything about how we navigate failure. Let's go back to the gym example. You skip the workout. A restorative inner voice doesn't shame you. It doesn't call you lazy. It gets curious. It asks, why did this happen? Let's look at the root cause. Am I physically exhausted because I stayed up too late working? Am I trying to force myself to do a specific type of workout, like heavy weightlifting, that I actually hate? What is the unmet need here?
I love that. What is the unmet need?
Exactly. Maybe the unmet need is simply rest. Your body was screaming for sleep. Or maybe the unmet need is a form of movement that actually brings you joy, like walking in nature or dancing, rather than feeling like a chore you have to suffer through.
It's such a gentler way to live. And the paradox is it actually produces significantly better results in the long run, because you're actually solving the real underlying problem, not just yelling at yourself for the symptom. If you realize you hate weightlifting, you can pivot to swimming. If you realize you're exhausted, you can prioritize sleep so you have energy the next day. You're working with yourself instead of against yourself.
And this restorative approach becomes especially crucial, literally life-changing, when we look at discipline through the lens of neurodiversity. The data from Keywell regarding neurodivergent parenting provides some of the most compelling, undeniable evidence that our traditional view of discipline is fundamentally scientifically flawed.
Yes, let's really dive deep into how this impacts children and adults who navigate the world with ADHD or autism. Traditional carrot and stick discipline famously spectacularly fails in these communities. And the reason is so important for everyone to understand, whether you are neurodivergent or not. Traditional discipline completely ignores the physical reality of how their brains process the world.
We have to talk about something called executive dysfunction. For a very long time, and unfortunately even still in many classrooms and workplaces today, people view the symptoms of executive dysfunction as a moral failing. They see a messy desk, missed deadlines, or an inability to start a project, and they label it as laziness, defiance, or a lack of caring. But it's a neurological reality. It's a difference in brain wiring. It has absolutely nothing to do with a lack of willpower or moral character.
I want to make sure we really understand this. Instead of just giving a clinical definition, what does executive dysfunction actually look like on a daily basis? Like, imagine I'm sitting at my desk looking at a massive project I need to start. What is happening in a neurodivergent brain versus a neurotypical brain?
That's a great way to look at it. Executive dysfunction manifests in several very specific hidden ways. One of the major ones is a lack of an inner voice that narrates problem solving. For someone with typical executive function, when they sit down and face that massive project, they have an internal monologue that automatically breaks it down into manageable steps. The voice says, okay, this is big. First, I'll open the document, then I'll write the outline, then I'll tackle the first paragraph. They can sequence the actions.
Okay, and for someone experiencing executive dysfunction,
that narrating voice might be entirely missing or incredibly faint.
So it's almost like trying to build a massive piece of complicated IKEA furniture. But your brain threw away the instruction manual that tells you what order to do things in and just left you staring at a terrifying pile of 500 screws and wooden planks.
That's exactly it.
You know what the final product is supposed to look like, but you have zero internal guidance on how to take the first step. Getting started feels literally impossible, not because you're lazy, but because you don't know how to start.
That is a brilliant analogy. It is exactly like losing the manual. You're overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the task because you can't mentally sequence it. The Keywell data also extensively mentions another symptom often referred to as time blindness.
Time blindness.
Yeah. This is a genuine neurological inability to accurately estimate how long a task will take or to instinctively feel the passage of time. A neurotypical person might know, Checking these emails will take 10 minutes. Someone with time blindness might feel like checking emails will take 5 hours, so they avoid it entirely. Or they might think writing a huge report will only take 20 minutes, so they start it right before the deadline.
And working memory issues are a huge part of this too, right?
Yes. Working memory is like your brain's temporary scratch pad. If your working memory is impaired, following multi-step instructions becomes incredibly difficult. If a boss says, go to the file room, grab the quarterly reports, cross-reference them with the client list, and then email me the discrepancies, by the time someone with executive dysfunction reaches the file room, they might have lost the third and fourth steps entirely.
And crucially, executive dysfunction involves a profound inability to sustain attention on tasks that are not inherently interesting or highly stimulating to that specific brain.
Which loops us right back to intrinsic motivation. If the task isn't interesting, if it doesn't provide dopamine, the brain literally, physically struggles to engage with the task. It's not a choice. Dr. Russell Barkley, who is one of the world's leading clinical experts on ADHD, notes that ADHD impacts the physical development of the prefrontal cortex by about 30%. So a young child with ADHD might have the executive functioning capacity of a child significantly younger. Their brain is developing at a different timeline.
And when you realize that biological reality, you immediately see how incredibly destructive traditional discipline is. Punishing a child or writing up an adult employee for a neurological lack of executive function is exactly like punishing someone for needing prescription glasses.
You can yell at someone with poor vision all day long. You can threaten to fire them if they don't read the board, but it doesn't magically fix their eyesight. All it does is deeply traumatize them and destroy their self-esteem.
It creates deep, lasting shame around something they literally cannot control. They internalize the punishment and start believing they are fundamentally broken. Now, I want to pause and make a very direct emotional connection here for you, the listener, because if you're listening to this and thinking, well, this is fascinating, but I don't have ADHD. I'm not neurodivergent, so why can't I get my act together? This still matters to you deeply. Because the reality of modern life is that it is absolutely exhausting our prefrontal cortexes on a daily basis.
We really need to understand what the prefrontal cortex does. It's the area right behind your forehead. It's the brain's management center. It's responsible for focus, emotional regulation, impulse control, and long-term planning. It is the exact part of the brain that handles all that executive function we were just talking about.
And the research from Mandy, a company that develops neurofeedback technology to measure brain activity, highlights how incredibly fragile and easily depleted this part of the brain actually is. Think about a normal Tuesday in your life. You are constantly bombarded with a relentless stream of stimuli. Push notifications on your phone, stressful news cycles, 100 micro-decisions at work, managing family schedules, worrying about the economy.
It's exhausting just listing it all.
It is, and all of that cognitive load draws energy directly from the prefrontal cortex. When you're chronically stressed or burnt out, your prefrontal cortex is essentially running on fumes.
Which means, regardless of whether you are neurodivergent or neurotypical, when that energy is depleted, your executive function plummets.
Exactly. To use a different analogy, your brain's management center has essentially gone home for the day, locked the doors, and left the interns in charge. So when you come home after a long, exhausting 10-hour day and you sit on the couch, and you literally cannot bring yourself to cook the healthy meal you planned, or you can't summon the energy to study for your certification exam, it is not because you are a lazy person. It is not because you lack moral discipline. It's because your prefrontal cortex is temporarily physically depleted. You are experiencing a very real form of situational executive dysfunction.
You're demanding high-level, complex executive function from an exhausted, depleted organ, and then you're ruthlessly shaming yourself when it physically cannot deliver. You are not broken. You are just operating under the wrong framework. You're trying to use a hammer to fix a delicate computer.
So this is the million-dollar question. If we abandon this harsh, strict discipline, if we accept that relying on the starter motor is going to burn us out, and if we stop trying to force our exhausted brains to comply through sheer willpower and shame, well, what on earth do we do instead? How do we actually get things done in our lives?
We have to completely shift our focus. We have to stop relying on internal pressure, which fluctuates and depletes, and start utilizing external systems. We need to look deeply at James Clear's concept of environment design.
I love this concept so much because it takes the moral weight off our shoulders. Clear talks about this startling study regarding organ donors that perfectly illustrates this point. Researchers were looking at data from different countries in Europe, trying to understand what drives people to become organ donors. And they found this massive, baffling discrepancy between two neighboring countries. In Denmark, the organ donation rate was incredibly low, hovering around 4%. But right next door, in Sweden, the donation rate was astronomical, almost 86%.
Which is a mind-boggling difference for two countries that share so much in terms of culture, geography, economics, and social structure. You wouldn't expect an 82% variance in human behavior between such similar populations.
Right, when you first hear that, your initial thought is, well, maybe the people in Sweden are just infinitely more altruistic. Maybe they have better moral discipline or a deeper cultural sense of community sacrifice. But when researchers dug in, they found that wasn't the case at all. The massive difference in behavior had absolutely nothing to do with internal discipline or moral superiority. It came down to a single, easily overlooked piece of paper.
It came down entirely to the default option.
Exactly. In Denmark, when you went to get your driver's license, the DMV forms had an opt-in box. It essentially said, check this box if you want to be an organ donor. It required you to take an action to change your status. In Sweden, they used an opt-out form. Their form said, check this box if you do not want to be an organ donor. You're automatically enrolled unless you took action to stop it.
The vast majority of people in both countries simply chose the default option to which they were assigned. They didn't agonize over the decision. They didn't make a deep, disciplined moral choice every time they renewed their license. They just went with the flow of the environment that had been designed for them.
That is the ultimate aha moment for anyone struggling with habits. Your environment is the default option to which you are assigned. If you want to change your behavior, you do not need more motivation. You do not need to read another book on willpower. You need to change your default. You need to redesign the room.
Think about it this way. If you rely on internal willpower to resist eating a chocolate chip cookie that's sitting right on your kitchen counter staring at you every time you walk by, you're going to lose eventually. Willpower is a finite resource. On day 1, you might resist. On day 5, when you're tired from work, you will eat the cookie.
Oh, I'd eat it on day 2.
Right. But if you design your environment so the cookie is never brought into the house to begin with, you don't need willpower at all. The default option is to not eat the cookie because eating it would require you to get in your car and drive to the store.
So how do we build these practical, low-friction systems in our daily lives? James Clear gives us a very simple rule. We need to systematically reduce the steps and the friction for good habits and drastically increase the steps and the friction for bad ones.
It's about becoming an architect of your own space. You are engineering your physical world to effortlessly support the life you want to live, rather than fighting against it.
Let's talk about some real-world examples that listeners can use right now. Say you want to eat healthier, you want to eat more vegetables, you could try to force yourself to eat a huge salad every day. Or you could look at the data on environment design. Studies show that if you simply buy dark green plates for your kitchen, the lack of color contrast between the plate and the food will cause you to unconsciously serve yourself 30% more greens.
That's amazing.
Right. You aren't forcing yourself. You aren't using discipline. The visual cue of the plate does the heavy lifting for you.
Or consider screen time. If you want to watch less television in the evenings, don't sit on the couch with the remote next to you and rely on discipline to keep the TV off. That's a losing battle. Instead, physically turn your living room furniture away from the screen. Make the room focused on conversation or reading. Or take the batteries out of the remote control and put them in a drawer in another room. Suddenly, turning on the TV requires effort. You have to get up, find the batteries, put them in. You've introduced just enough friction to the bad habit to break the automatic loop.
I love the example Clear gives about flossing, too. I mean, how many of us struggle to floss consistently? We lie to our dentists every 6 months.
Oh, everyone lies to their dentist.
Exactly. But Clear found that his habit changed completely when he stopped relying on willpower. He took a bowl of those little pre-made plastic flossers and set it right out in the open, right next to his toothbrush. The visual cue was constantly there. The friction of opening the medicine cabinet, finding the string and cutting it was entirely gone. He changed the default.
And this brings us full circle, connecting perfectly back to Dr. Sharon Gam and her approach to health. Remember her fermented turmeric?
Yes, this is such a great example. As an exercise physiologist, she knows that fermented turmeric is incredibly good for reducing inflammation and supporting her gut microbiome. But she's honest enough to admit that it tastes terrible and is challenging to eat. So, does she rely on sheer brute force discipline to choke down a massive, miserable bowl of it every single day?
No, she doesn't fight herself. She does something behavioral scientists call shrinking the change. She makes it such a tiny, almost a noticeable part of her routine that it requires zero willpower. She takes a tiny amount, maybe mixes it into a smoothie or takes it quickly, integrating it seamlessly into her life, and completely removes the overwhelming pressure.
She aligns the small action with her larger identity as someone who cares deeply for her health, and she designs a system where consuming it requires very little emotional or physical energy. She isn't performing a feat of discipline, she's just executing a well-designed system.
It's entirely about making things easier for yourself, not harder. We have this twisted, almost puritanical belief in our culture that if something isn't agonizingly difficult, it somehow doesn't count. We feel like we have to suffer, we have to bleed and sweat to truly earn our success or our health.
And that is the exact punitive mindset we have to aggressively unlearn. Suffering is not a prerequisite for growth. Often it's an obstacle to it.
Exactly.
As we wrap up this deep dive today, I want to bring us back to that beautiful, grounding, positive discipline mantra from Marcellus Smith Boyle that we discussed earlier: connection before correction.
It's the absolute foundation of everything we've talked about today, from managing kids to managing our own exhausted minds.
Before you rush to correct your own behavior, before you start berating yourself for missing a deadline or skipping the gym or eating the cookie, before you let that punitive inner voice tell you that you are lazy and undisciplined, pause. Just stop. Connect with yourself first. And I mean this literally, physically. Give yourself a physical hug. Wrap your arms tightly around your own shoulders. Take a deep breath.
It might sound silly to some people or a little too woo-woo, but it has a profound, documented physiological effect. Physical affection, deep pressure therapy, even when it comes from yourself, physically signals safety to your nervous system. It triggers the release of oxytocin. That's the feel-good neurochemical that physically lowers cortisol, calms the amygdala, and soothes that exhausted, overworked prefrontal cortex we talked about. You're literally changing your brain chemistry with a hug.
Acknowledge your feelings without an ounce of judgment. Say to yourself out loud or in your mind, I love you, and I see that you're having a really hard time right now. I see that you are tired. It's only from that place of calm connection, that place of restorative understanding, that you can actually begin to make a positive, sustainable change. You cannot shame yourself into a better life.
If you take nothing else away from this entire hour we spent together, please hear this clearly. You are not lazy. You do not lack moral fiber. You do not need to push yourself harder until you break. You need to stop relying on a punitive, forced discipline system that historically, psychologically, and neurologically has never actually worked for anyone over the long haul.
You deserve a life built on systems that support you, not on pressure that slowly breaks you down. And that brings me to one final thought, something for you to mull over today, long after this audio stops playing. Think about the one daily task you dread the absolute most, the one thing you constantly have to force yourself to do day in and day out, the thing that drains your willpower before you even start. What if, starting tomorrow, you completely stop fighting yourself and instead spent that exact same amount of energy redesigning the room you do it in?